Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the That Was Stupid podcast. I am your host, John Seidel, and I'm excited to have you back for another episode. And just like all of them, I don't think I'll ever say I'm not excited about a guest, but I'm excited about today's guest. And what is so interesting about her is we thought we were going to be talking about one thing, and I think we ended up talking about 5 different things. And that's actually good news for you. It's not that we were just on rabbit trails. It's that I didn't realize the depths of her story. Her name is Bryson Kessler. She is a small business owner. Well, it's really bigger than just a small business. It's a boutique in Birmingham, Alabama called Clover Bee, but it's also available online. So she services people all over the country. And she also has her own podcast, which we're going to talk about. And what's interesting is there's going to be something that I thought was going to be kind of off limits that ends up not just not being off limits, but she ends up telling me and you something that she doesn't really often share. So I am excited for you to hear that. But first, like always, our podcast and our time together is sponsored by the Veritas Creative. If you have a book trapped inside of you, if you have an idea, if you are a business that is looking for help, or a church or a nonprofit that's looking to expand your reach or your brand, go to theveritascreative.com and let them help and consult you on the best way to make digital media work for you. So with that said, we are going to talk to Bryson Kessler, have an interesting story about how I met her. And I think you're going to enjoy what she says, especially for people who maybe come from a divorce background, people who come from a story of messy sanctification like I do. This is going to really, really encourage you. So without further ado, Bryson Kessler. Bryson, thank you so much for joining the That Was Stupid podcast. I joke that you are one of those people that I feel like I've known forever, even though we've only known each other a few months. And so this is quite a treat for me. So thank you. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me here, John. I totally agree with you. It feels like we've known each other for years, even though it's just been a matter of months.
And the funny thing about all of that, how we got to know each other and whatnot, or maybe a story that I think actually confirms that is, met you and your husband at a conference a few months back. And before I knew it, we're in the back of a cab, all 3 of us together on our way to a baseball game. And I'm like telling you my whole life story, including stuff that I had only up to that point, like shared with very few people, which was my journey, with alcohol over the last year and alcoholism. Yeah. And you were just so attentive. And I guess that's probably why you have such a successful podcast, which we will talk about. But, I think you have such an ability and quality to bring the best out of people. And so I'm excited to try to mimic that and bring it out of you today.
Well, thank you. And I just so admire you. I mean, that day that my husband came home and was like, you've got to meet this guy. I met him he was sitting at my table. He's so awesome. And then we got to share a cab ride to the Red Sox game, and just so admire you and your courage and your story, and loved hearing it and having the opportunity to be part of it.
Well, let's kind of start. We talked about your husband. I want to start there. Well, I guess maybe before that, give everyone just kind of an overview of who you are and what you do. Because you kind of got these 2 interesting streams. You've got this business stream, and then you've got this content stream. And so give everyone just kind of a quick overview of what you do.
Yeah. Well, I would say growing up, I kind of had 2 passions, sort of callings in life. One would be ministry. And as a teenager, I felt like the Lord called me into ministry. And also, from as early as I can remember, my sisters and I would play, quote, store. We would drive our little Hot Wheels up to, like, we had an unfinished basement. We'd drive our Hot Wheels up to one of the little studs where the studs was open, and we'd order. And so I feel like the Lord also had just this entrepreneurial call on my life, and didn't really know how that would play out, but went to Auburn University, graduated in communications, and worked in retail growing up in high school and college, but spent my summers in college doing ministry work, doing internships in ministries. And then I got married right out of college, moved to Nashville, and immediately became the associate student minister at First Baptist Nashville downtown, which is Nashville's crazy now. It wasn't quite so crazy when I was there. But now it's crazy. I don't even recognize it. So, and then about a year later, went and planted a church in Nashville, had the opportunity to be part of a church plant, which was so cool. We just celebrated 20 years at the Ryman. So church at the Ryman, you can imagine how amazing that was.
Wow.
But still had that entrepreneurial call in my life. And so my husband at the time was called to move to Birmingham. So we moved from Nashville to Birmingham. I had an 18-month-old daughter, and that entrepreneurial spirit was still really brewing in me. And ministry had been tough, just being part of a church plant, being a new mom. And truthfully, my marriage was struggling a little bit. And so my dad came to my sisters. I have two sisters, and he said, hey, if you guys want to open a business together, we had been talking about that. He said, I'm willing to give you some of your inheritance money. I believe in you and you can do it. And so we opened our first store, which was called Fireflies and Fairy Tales, kids store, children's clothing. We got into wholesale, had a wholesale line across the whole nation of kids' clothes, designing and producing kids' clothes. And then we opened a second store, which was called the Swanky Stork, which was maternity. And that is the store that I run to this day, although it's called Clover Bee. And we'll get into all of that later. But yeah, still trying to figure out, how does entrepreneurial marry with ministry, because that call to ministry was still there. And that's what ultimately led me to the content part of my life, Honey for Your Heart, the podcast. So in a nutshell, that's kind of the journey that got me to the store and the podcast. I also went through a divorce in that time, and we can kind of chat about that as well. But remarried to my current husband, Todd. So the Lord has been so faithful. There's been a lot of peaks and valleys, but he's been so faithful through it all.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot there, and I'm excited to get into it because I think the kind of, not main event, right? But what my first idea in having you on was to talk about the business, right? And so, because I love to talk to entrepreneurs. I'm an entrepreneur. My wife is an entrepreneur. I love to talk to women business owners. My mom is a woman business owner, and so I just have a passion there. And before we even got on this, I said, hey, we've never really talked about the divorce aspect. I know it's part of your story. I just want to make sure, if that comes up, if you're comfortable and you're like, actually, I love talking about that. Yeah. And so I actually want to go there because I think, as you know, Bryson, I am a person that is really big on redemption stories and the mess that is created, how God uses that for our good and his glory. And so you mentioned your first husband. You mentioned remarrying Todd. I think there's a lot of people who think that our lives are just, easy and simple, and you're the owner of this massively successful boutique empire. But you have this hard story. Why don't you tell us that hard story?
Yeah, I would love to. I do love sharing it, because I think when we share our stories, for one, we realize that we're not alone in the hard. Even if our hard looks different, we're not alone in that. But it also is just how, one, God continues to get the glory for our stories, but we remind ourselves of how he showed up in our stories. So yeah, my first husband and I, we met in college and met through church and had a group of friends that were all believers. Everything was right. We did everything right. And graduated from college. I went into ministry. He was a ministry partner with me. And I think the number one place the devil is at work, especially in the lives of ministers, is in their marriages. Because if he can tear the marriage apart, he can gain a lot of ground. So we were newlyweds. We're working with students. So we're together all the time, and we're pouring into the lives of students, but you feel like you're working on your marriage, even though you're really not, because you're physically together, but you're not really pouring into each other. And I look back and see that was really where the cracks started forming for us, because by the time we got home, we're exhausted. We'd poured into kids and students. You know how they are. They can go all day long, all night long. They have no lack of energy, and
There's
loved
drama.
It. Oh yeah. Oh, I had the 8th grade girls, John. Oh my goodness. I was like, y'all wear me out with all your drama. I can't handle it.
Yeah. My little girl's 9 and I'm already starting to like see that. And I'm like, oh my
It's bad. It's bad. Yeah. We had to have quite a few come to Jesus meetings, literally. Like, okay. So yeah, that was really our life. And then starting this church plant, there was 15 of us. And so you're everything. You're the greeters, you're the parkers, you're the ushers, you're the finance committee, you're everything. And so again, we're just pouring ourselves into ministry and not pouring ourselves into each other in the way that we should. So when we finally moved from Nashville to Birmingham and had our first child, those cracks really, really, really began to show because we no longer had something to really pour ourselves into, and we just were together. And so at that point, we did start some counseling, but the marriage for several reasons, it just didn't work. And so we ended up divorcing. We did have a second child, actually. Tried for years to make it work, had a second child, but ended up divorcing when my older child was 5 and my younger child was 1. And John, I grew up Southern Baptist. I grew up with a long line of faith, a strong heritage of faith. You don't get divorced. Like, that's not part of your story. That's not what happens. And so I felt a lot of shame. I felt a lot of I've been in ministry. I'm supposed to be an example. In divorce, there's a reason the Lord says he hates it. It's ugly. It is ugly, not only for you and your immediate family, but even those kids that we have poured into Nashville, that we poured into there, the new church. People were shocked to hear that we were divorced. And you could see where it really rocked some people. And like, well, I learned a lot from them. Was that real? Was it not real? It was hard. It was a really hard road. And watching your children go through it, it's just a hard place. And I want to put the weight of that out there, because that's where God steps in and just meets us in those places that feel so shameful and so heavy. And you know this, where you feel like you just kind of are an embarrassment to God and to the faith, and your life is not anything like you thought it would look like. And God really met me in that place. I remember thinking, I'll never get married again, because you hear all these crazy stories about men and they start dating these women and you don't know who they are and they're doing things to their kids. I was just like, that's it. I'm never getting married again. But Todd and we actually dated in college. 15 years prior to this, we had dated. I like to say I shattered his heart. He would agree with that. I clearly was not paying attention to the Lord, I guess at that moment. I don't know. But we went our separate ways and had not seen each other or had any contact for 15 years, and ended up living a mile down the road from each other. And our daughters were the same age, ended up in the same class. And so we reconnected, and just that same just friendship and connection that we had 15 years prior was quickly and easily recovered and refound. And so we started dating and then married, I guess it's a couple years later. And, but here's a part of the story I'm going to reveal, John, that I've not revealed to a lot of people. So only on the That Was Stupid podcast.
Come on.
Because when you said to me, does it make sense? Or there's things in your life that was stupid? I was like, let me give you the list of things that I have. So when I met Todd, again, in this place of just shame and feeling like such a failure, Todd and I started dating, and Todd was such a safe place for me. And Todd was so loving and so caring. It was something that I longed for so long. And so we immediately connected. And before we were engaged, I found out that I was pregnant. And this, you want to talk about shame and even further. So I'm a mom of 2 in my 30s, have been a minister on church staff, ministered to countless people. And here I am, pregnant out of wedlock. And you want to talk about just lowest of low of low. It was a moment I will never, ever, ever forget. But that's the moment that I look back on and I see where the Lord really started saying, okay, now we can work. Now you're ready. and really he stripped away all of the things that I could stand on that were, well, I'm a minister, I'm doing this, I come from this family, I've never done this. All of that was gone. All of that was stripped away. And he really started to redeem and restore my soul in ways that only he could. And Todd and I knew that we wanted to get married. And, that was obviously not the path we wanted to take. Both of our families were so, they're strong believers. Both were very accepting and forgiving. And so we got married, and we committed to using our story, to being honest and using our story to help others. And so God took just ashes and turned it into total beauty. So my child that's walking around, my youngest child, Micah, today is literally this visible and tangible reminder to me that God redeems and he restores and he forgives and he makes all things new, and he's good. He's good. Even when and especially when we're not, he is good and he's faithful. So our story's got a lot of twists and turns,
Wow.
but yeah. So 12 years, we're celebrating almost 13 years of marriage, and it has been wonderful. We lead a small group that is literally couples that have been married for like 1 year or less. We just shared our story with them, and we were asked to lead that group. So again, I go back to that girl that was so full of shame and embarrassment, and this isn't really who I am. And then now 12, 13 years later, we're leading a group of young marrieds and telling our story and saying God is good and he's faithful. So it's really cool.
Okay. Yeah. Did not see this coming. Thank you.
I knew I could throw that on you.
Yeah. And so I think, there's questions I have, but I think, I obviously see through things through the lens of my own experience. I think since I've come out with my own story, there's been some legalistic backlash. And so, similar to you, I know where I'm going to use this story, but I think the hard part is, how do you get over that shame right away? So as people are saying, I don't know the details of your divorce, but I'm sure there's people, well, do you have biblical grounds to divorce or do you not? Right.
100%.
You obviously were sleeping together before you got married. God's not going to how do you deal with those people who are saying, whether they're saying it or not in these words, that was stupid. You got, you married, you got divorced, you had a child, technically out of that was stupid.
Yeah.
So what do you say to those detractors, those people like us who have messy sanctification stories, as I like to say? What do you say to them?
I think it's twofold there. One, I think it is important to listen to people who try to speak into your life. We need to hear truth. Truth is not always easy to hear, but we need to hear truth, and we need to hear the truth in love. So I've really tried to be able to listen to people who are speaking truth, make sure that there's not something that it's a blind spot in my life that I need to pay attention to. For example, could we get married again? Is that, there were definitely a lot of legalistic issues there. So I think it's important to listen to truth and being willing to listen to it. I also think it's important to set boundaries, because there's a point where the truth has been told and it no longer needs to be just beat over the head with it. Or it may simply be, you and I disagree on this subject, and that's okay. I had a good friend who talked about faith, and he said, there's an essential bucket and there's a non-essential bucket. The essential bucket, like Jesus was God's son. He is the only way to heaven. He did die on the cross. He did raise 3 days later. Those are essential, like it's either you believe it or you don't. There's no disagreeing to be a true believer. But there are other non-essential buckets, and a lot of political things that the Bible isn't very specific about. So as believers, we can have great conversations around these topics and we can learn more from each other. But at the end of the day, it's okay if we just disagree. It doesn't make me less of a believer or you less of a believer. So I think learning to understand that and understand that there may be people that I either just don't agree with, or I also know that there are pieces of my story that they don't know, that they don't need to know, and that's okay. And I think being willing to just understand that they don't know those people and those pieces of the story, and accept, even though it's hurtful, accept that it's a time to be quiet and not argue back. And honestly, John, I mean, my friendships changed a lot after that. There were friends that they were so disappointed that they really couldn't be friends anymore. And that's hurtful. And I still pray to this day that maybe the Lord will restore those one day. But at the end of the day, I say the Lord looks at me through the lens of his son. So he loves me as much in that darkest, most shameful moment as he does whatever my best day I've ever had. He doesn't change, and he's consistent. So when I find myself getting lost in the conversations, or this person thinks that, or that person's so wrong, or is this person right or is it not, going back to this place of the only thing that matters in my life is that I'm a child of God. He looks at me through the lens of his son, who paid for that sin, that Micah and all of the other sins that I have committed and will commit. He's paid for that. It's done. So I can let it be done in my life because he says it's done. Even if others can't let it be done, that's okay.
Yeah, and I think that's the important part when we talk about sanctification and redemption is, and you kind of touched on this, is I don't think you're going out and saying, probably the advice that you're giving to your 1-year-old Marys or even pre-marrieds is not, hey, yeah, go ahead and, get pregnant before you're married. That's a great idea. I'm going to defend that till the day I die. Right. And I think that's where some people get confused when I talk about my messy story. Your messy story is, I'm not out here saying that like it was a good thing and I'm so excited and justified that I was drinking too much. No, I know that's a sin. I know that I shouldn't have done that, right? Mm-hmm. And there's repentance in my heart and remorse. And so, but there's some people I think that get so caught up in like, they want to be the ones that dole out the punishment for what we did. Mm-hmm. And that's up to God, right? And I can tell you that I'm living with consequences from those decisions. Trust me, I am. Just because I'm not talking about all those consequences, like
100%. Yes,
there are seen and unseen consequences that I'm living with, and so I think what you're talking about, the remorse, the repentance, is a key aspect of that messy sanctification. So now, as a result, and again, we're going to get to some of these other parts, but you marry Todd, and what's interesting is that you become a blended family. He has kids that he brings into the marriage, and you have kids that you bring into the marriage, or kid, or however where you can explain. A lot of people would say that was stupid, right? Blended families. Uh-huh. That is really difficult. And you're probably saying, yes, it is.
Yes.
So talk to us about that decision and how you've navigated being a blended family, because I think there's a lot of people listening out there who are in that position.
Yes. And I would say that's probably been one of our biggest challenges, although we have been very blessed in that area as well. So I've mentioned in my story that my daughter and Todd's daughter were actually in kindergarten together. And so they were literally best friends from the start, best friends. So even when Todd and I told the kids that we were getting married, they screamed and hugged each other and said, we get to be sisters. And so it was really just such a beautiful blessing. But in that, when you are blending families, it is very challenging. And we speak to a lot of people about this because you have two other totally different households that these kids are going to. The rules might look different. I mean, even as young children, bedtime might look different. How you eat might look different. How you operate your home life can look completely different to what they experience when they go to the other house. And so for us, it was a challenge, especially Todd's daughter, Reagan, who is amazing. She's now a freshman, about to be a sophomore in college, and love her to death at Auburn. But she would come in and our lives looked a little different from what she was used to in her other home. But then my children were still following the structure of our home life. And they would kind of be like, well, why does Reagan not have to do this? Or why does Reagan not have to do that? And so it was this struggle of, for me, especially as a mom, how do I maintain and I'm going to use the word because it is what it is, control, which control is the battleground of many women's hearts, especially moms. How do I maintain my control? Which again, I'm going to go with that was stupid, not ideal. But at the time, how do I maintain my control and still love Reagan and make her feel welcome in our home when she's here and allow Todd to have the time with her that he needed, it was challenging. And Todd and I, we rarely have strong disagreements, but that's where we would hit bumps quite a bit, and learning just how to navigate, because in his mind, she's coming in and he just wants to just soak up every second he can get with her and love her and make her feel like she's part of our family. And then on the other hand, I'm wanting the same, but also how do I navigate this with the other kids that are here and not just feel like everything we've worked for, scheduling and all that kind of stuff, is just shot out the window at the time. So my advice to be with blending families, I think you have to communicate well. Todd and I he is a wonderful communicator. I tend to get a little mad and yell and fuss and scream, and then he stays very calm. And then eventually we can have a good conversation. But to be really, really, really honest with how you're feeling with each other, but also be very focused on finding a solution that works for both. And that may take some time, and it changes as the stages of life change. When they're young kids, that's one thing. When they're teenagers, that's another thing. And now we're experiencing college. That's a whole other thing. So I think communication is key. Honesty is key. But then the focus is not to win the argument or win your side, but how do we do this together that works for everyone?
Mm-hmm. I think when I first met Todd, he was talking about you. You had said something there. You had said that you're the one that maybe gets worked up, and he said, I think he called you a fireball or a firecracker in the best way possible.
Yeah.
And then he used this phrase. He said, she's the wow and I'm the how.
So true.
And I thought that's great, because Todd's like a numbers guy, right?
Yes.
He's, very mild mannered.
Yes.
Very, like he's even keeled. It's great. And so, but he met me. He's like, John, you're not that. You and my wife would really get along.
That's exactly right. That's what he told me.
And I think that's a compliment to both of us. I'm going to take it as one, right?
I agree.
So, okay. So we've got these 2-3-ish that was stupid moments already. Let's get to the one that we are originally we're going to focus on, which is, so your dad comes, he gives you this money to start a business. At this point, are you married, divorced, remarried?
Married with one child, my first child.
Okay. So that's right, because you said earlier all of this was you were building this empire while you went through a divorce. So talk to us about how a divorced mom then picks up the pieces and builds this boutique empire, which I'm going to call it, because just tell us a little bit. How many stores do you have?
Yeah, we actually have one store, but we also have online. So we have customers all across the United States and hopefully eventually globally.
And it does really well, right? It does really well. It's great, right? And so tell us, how do you pick up the pieces? How do you do that and turn this into, a boutique empire?
Yeah. I will say if I was doing it by myself, I don't think I could have done it, but the ability to partner with my sisters was such a gift. And going back to the how and the wow. So my middle sister is very much the how. She's the numbers. She's the, I'm still always the wow side of things, but we balanced each other out really well. So I'm looking like, oh, we should buy this. We should do that. We should be this. And she's coming back going, okay, here's the budget. Here's what we can do. So it was really, there's such a great balance between my sisters and I. And so doing that together, and they were so helpful to fill in for me at times when I couldn't do it, when I was dealing with the divorce, dealing with lawyers, trying to figure out scheduling with my kids. So I think partnership is so key there. And the Lord was so gracious to allow us to start those businesses together. They've since stepped out of the business for various reasons, but so I'm in it alone now. But starting it out, just having their support and their partnership. And it wasn't always easy. I don't want to paint that picture. We had some knockdown, drag out fights because I wanted to do something. My other sisters didn't think it was a good idea. You have to learn to compromise, just like in any relationship. How do we compromise? How do we listen to each other well, but work towards a common goal? And so I think because of their partnership, that was why we were able to really get it going and get it off the ground.
And so I think one of the things that we had talked about prior to this in the That Was Stupid is, you've rebranded, I think, a total of like 3 times, right? That's stupid.
Yes.
You don't do that. My wife and I,
I know.
rebranded her business once, and like we'd never want to do it again because there's so much that goes into it. So take us through why did you rebrand, and really kind of take us through those decisions that end up being good, right? But in the moment, you're like, I don't know, right? So take us through that.
Yes. Well, as you know, with retail and pretty much any business, the times change. Your customers change, times change, the economy changes. And so this was our second store. Our first store was the kids store, which is closed now, but this was the Swanky store. We started maternity. It was born out of, I was pregnant with my second child and felt like I could not find clothes that I thought were cute and stayed true to who I was, but obviously would accommodate a growing belly. And so in business, I've learned when you see a niche, you just, if you can, you go for it and you fill it. So we were like, we already have children. We've got moms that are coming in here pregnant. Just makes sense to let's start a maternity store. Totally not in the business plan, but why not? I mean, just start a second store, no big deal.
Which, by the way, I can say that I have a hard time finding clothes that accommodate my growing belly where I still look cute in as well. So, I mean, this is a guy problem as well.
Hey, maybe there's a niche there that I need to look into, John. Not sure how good I'd be at that, but yeah, so we started the maternity store, and it was only maternity, and the Lord really grew it. There's a lot of backstory there, but the Lord grew it quickly. And then 2008 hit and the recession. And I remember literally like the day before, it seemed like we could sell these $300 dresses and people didn't even blink. And then it literally felt like I came to work the next day and I couldn't sell a $20 dress. I mean, it was crazy. So I learned I got my first lesson in being able to pivot quickly during that time. So we, ultimately kind of pivoted and started bringing in some, what we would say, non-maternity lines that were less expensive, but worked for a growing belly. So we pivoted at that point. And then after we've been in business, I guess we've been in business about 7 years, we started having moms come back to us and they would say, I have had my baby, but my body's different and my lifestyle is different and my needs are different. And there's all these cute boutiques around, but they're catering to these young 20s or late college. That's just not me. I'm not there anymore. So we started seeing this again, seeing a need and a niche. And so we started offering what we would call a beyond the bump section of the store. And we really started seeing that grow. But people were so embarrassed. They're like, I don't want to shop at the Swanky store, a maternity store. People felt I almost we thought about creating bags that said, I'm not pregnant, I just like the clothes, because it was like such a challenge. Or seriously, John, people would come in and they'd be like, I'm not pregnant. And I'm like, right. You can't get pregnant walking in here. You're good.
It's not something you catch in the air.
That's right. You're all right. You're good. But we saw it like really hinder the growth that we were seeing happen. So we were like, okay, we're seeing this grow. This is a thing. Maternity is a very small niche. So we knew if we really did want to expand, we had to really go after this audience. So we rebranded we called it Cradle and Bee. So Cradle's still the baby maternity, but Bee was our Queen Bee moms is where it came from. So we rebranded to Cradle and Bee. We still had our maternity section, but we had a whole new big beyond the bump section. And it really started to grow a lot. But at that point, COVID hits. And everybody knows, yes, COVID, the C word. And so, and we were starting at that point, we were starting to see maternity phase out a lot. There were so many options to wear clothes that weren't true maternity that even people who were really pregnant were going more for the beyond the bump and not the true maternity, which is so much more expensive. But COVID, do you remember after COVID and everything sitting on the boats in the oceans?
Yes.
Stuffs?
Like in LA,
pictures?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, literally a whole entire season of maternity clothes were sitting on a boat. We couldn't get one thing in for maternity. Thankfully, by God's grace, we had the other side of the store, which was doing really well. So that was kind of the nail in the coffin for maternity. I was out of that stage anyway, wasn't really feeling it anymore. We were seeing those sales really tank. So we were like, you know what? We're just going to use this as a way to just completely phase out maternity, because the Lord has really brought in this new market of Beyond the Bump. And we had moms coming in and shopping with daughters who were older because they wanted more modest type clothing. But then people were like confused again. Well, Cradle and Bee, is it kids? Is it maternity? There's no maternity in here. What is it? So I was like, oh no, we've got to rebrand again. And we play off the C and the B, and we had our B, and everybody loved that. And so we were like, okay, what is a C word that we can still keep our CB? So we came up with the word clover, which we liked it. We're like, it's lucky, it's unique, it's rare, that we want people to feel like they're getting lucky when they come and shop with us. So we rebranded. Mark my words, John, I'm saying it here on your podcast for the final time. We rebranded.
Let's hope some other pandemic or recession or, something else doesn't crash, because then
Please, Lord.
We get into a war and then you're communist and B, I don't know.
I know. I think I'm just going to be out at that point. I don't know. So we are now Clover and Bee, but yeah, we joked about, and we actually moved a few doors down to a bigger space. We kind of joked about, if you can find us and you can figure out what our name is, you can shop with us. So we're Clover and Bee today.
I love, obviously I think there's a lesson in pivoting there, right? I think it's so interesting that when you see, you pivoted twice, really, like that's what precipitated the name changes, right? It's not just, we just want a new name, right?
Correct.
It's, hey, you know what? Now we're going to do more than just maternity. Hey, now, our stuff is stuck on a boat, but the market is different. So now we're just going to focus on more of the boutique aspect. So yeah, there's lessons in pivoting there. But what would you say are some of the other lessons there when it comes to that? Is it trust? Is it, I don't know. What else did you learn during that time?
I really learned, and it seems like something I'm saying on repeat today, to be a good listener. We learn to listen to our customers. I think it's so easy when you own a business, or even for you when you write, or we think we know who we are and what our business is. And it's essential to know that to a degree as the owner, as the CEO. But you have to be willing to listen to your people. And there were times that I would kind of start chasing maybe some trends or some fads that I was like, oh, they're going to love this. And then it would sit in the store and it wouldn't sell. And I started thinking, I want to hear from our customers. So we would use our Instagram, and we would do it periodically, every few months or so, and just put up in stories, hey, what are we doing well? What are we not doing well? How can we change? And we started consistently hearing, hey, remember, you're not the boutique for the young 20s and the late college students. You're us. That's why we love you. Don't necessarily chase all these fads. Or even hearing, I love your team, but I wish this piece would change. So I think being willing to be a good listener and not be offended by what people are saying, but say, again, going back to letting people speak truth into your life and understanding there's a time we need to hear it. There's a time we need to get back and check and say, you know what, you're right. I'm buying clothes that young 20s would like, because that's the big fashion trend right now, not my true customers. So I think learning to really listen to our customers well, while staying true to who we are, was really key. And then the other thing for me, John, that is so pivotal, and it kind of, that'll get us into the content and the podcast as well, is it is my job to see customers as people, not as sales. It is my job to see, our motto at Clover and Bee is, it's always bigger. So the minute someone walks in the store, yes, they're there to shop, but there's always a bigger story and a bigger need. And it may just be as simple as we're providing an outfit that they need. But especially during COVID, we have people that started coming in and we were dressing them for funerals, or they're telling us a story about someone that they know that has COVID. And we to see people as people and not sales, and to operate from that perspective, including my team. It is my job to shepherd my team. They are people. They're not people who are accomplishing something for me. They are people that I shepherd. So I think those two lessons for me were really big in learning to really own a store well. That's a key to success to me.
dang. Like I literally just had to write down a little note because I'm like, this needs to be one of the clips, because I think seeing people, like you said, not just as sales, right, but seeing their story, I think is huge. When I was in the news business, I was lucky enough to work for an organization that was, not just churn and burn, although there were aspects of that because it's the news business, right?
Sure.
But there's that sign that I mean, they didn't invent, but that said, use things, love people, right? Instead of love things, use people, right? And I think that's kind of the essence of what you're talking about. And so, because I remember when you were telling me the story of how the podcast started, I mean, that was an integral part. You said, listen, we want to offer something bigger and better and deeper. And so I'm hearing all these stories of people coming into my store, and it's amazing. And I want to give their stories to other people. Yeah. And so talk to us about the genesis of Honey for Your Heart and how you use that to serve people.
Yeah, this is probably my favorite thing, my favorite aspect of the store. But I told you back in the beginning, I had these two passions and calling in my life, entrepreneurship and ministry. And so as Clover Bee really took off, we started seeing, sales numbers we'd never seen before, profit we'd never seen before. Everything was just working. And we won Retailer of the Year. I mean, all these things happened. And John, that success was awesome and it felt great, but there was still this emptiness that this doesn't matter. These things don't matter. And it's like, how do we take this success and the platform that we've given, how do we take it and we make it matter, make it really count? So going back to people are not sales, they're stories. And how do we use this store as a way to further these stories and impact these stories in the kingdom? So there was one day I happened to be working the floor. I rarely work the floor, but I was working the floor. It was a Monday, never in the store on a Monday, happened to be there on a Monday. And the store was actually really dead, which is not unusual for Mondays, but there wasn't anyone in the store. That's a little unusual. So there was a lady that walked in and I kept thinking, she looks so familiar to me. I don't know why. So I'm helping her and she ends up coming to the counter. And then I realized she looks just like this friend of mine who is a neighbor. And she had been telling me about her sister that's going through cancer. And so I asked her, I said, are you Sarah's sister? And she said, I am. And I said, I have been praying for you. And John, she started sobbing. I mean, just sobbing. And again, keep in mind, no one else is in the store. The Lord's faithfulness and kindness, no one else is in the store. The backstory of that is my sister has been going through cancer for 8 years. And I also lost my mom to cancer almost 30 years ago. And so this particular lady knew that, and she knew that Sarah had shared with me. And so she said, I have been praying for somebody just to talk to about this. She has 2 young children. So we ended up having this 30-minute conversation about what my experience was losing my mom, how to encourage her in these days as she's navigating this battle. And it was just this unbelievable God-ordained moment. And she left, and I thought to myself, that moment and that feeling was better than the biggest sales day we've ever had in the store, the best accomplishment we've ever received. That moment was so wonderful. And that moment is eternal. How do I take this moment and do that? And that's where the Lord literally downloaded the idea of the podcast in my mind, because going back to COVID, we were hearing these stories of people that had lost loved ones. We hear stories of people dealing with infidelity, and we would connect them with other customers. And so God really downloaded in my mind, share the stories, be faithful to share the stories. John, again, that was stupid moment. I might have listened to 2 podcasts in my life. I mean, that just wasn't my world. I didn't have time. I didn't know anything about podcasts. I'm like, what do you do? How do you record a podcast? But I could not shake the feeling of, this is it. This is it. So I called a sweet friend, a trusted friend who lived in Nashville. She's worked with Kendra Scott. She's got her finger on the pulse of all the trendy new things. But she also used to be a store manager of mine. So she's real familiar with our business. So I called her and I just said, here's something I'm thinking. Is this stupid or what do you think? And she goes, she said, no, I love this idea. She said, I think it is so who you are. And I think it is so needed in our world today. And she gave me the name of a producer. She said, you need to call this girl. Her name is Elizabeth Evans. She is wonderful, a godsend. I called Elizabeth. I said, I have no idea what I'm doing. This is stupid. I don't know anything. I have no budget. I have no name. I don't have any equipment. I don't even know who the guests are going to be, but God's told me to do this. And she immediately was like, I love this. Let's do it. And held my hand from day one. And I mean, John, we literally released episode 1 and it charted on Apple. I was like sending Elizabeth screenshots like, we're like number 40 in the faith-based podcast. We were like number 40. And she's like, oh my goodness, that's amazing. So that was season 1. We're currently recording season 3. God just continues to bring stories and grow the podcast. And it's all him, because that was really stupid.
And all the while, I mean, and you're still, part of a blended family. You're still, building Clover and Bee, right? That's
right.
Still part of it. And you're doing this podcast. And I'm sure there are moments where you get, overwhelmed, but yet you have, you're happy, but more importantly,
Yes.
you're joyful. Right. And I think, as I'm going to be talking about in my book coming up, part of, my story of kicking the alcohol addiction, it was finding my identity. Right.
That's right.
And what I realized is, I've always been a storyteller, but my identity is bold, courageous, decisive storyteller. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, after that season over the last year of healing and reconciliation and whatnot, I started back this podcast. Right. Cause I'm like, I really enjoy it. I love talking to people. I love telling stories like you, right? And even my wife was like, do you think you're going to get burned out? Like you have to write a book, you have to do, and I'm like, I just really enjoy it. So I found people to help me on the aspects that I don't enjoy.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the lesson, is that when we take chances and do stuff that we know are part of our identity and calling, I don't necessarily like the phrase, like, find what you love and you'll never work a day in your life. Cause it's like, no, there are days where I'm still like, it feels like work to do things, right? But yet I think there is some aspect of truth to that. When you find your identity and you find your calling, you're doing what the Lord has called you to do. So I love hearing. The other thing I just wanted to say that I think is important, I think you mentioned this a couple times, when it as it related to your business story and the podcast, is there are moments where we can look at the circumstances and say, this is awful, right? So the recession, which it was awful, COVID, it was awful. Yep. No one in the store, right? And yet I think the Lord has a bigger picture. Hey, I'm working.
Always.
Like, I'm not going to get corny and be like, there are some televangelist preachers like, your setback is beating is God's setup, like, I'm not going to get corny like that, but I am going to say, like, no, like when we can look at like that, there are times that God uses our struggles, not times. Absolutely. He always uses our struggles, right? Yeah. And so you can look out at your business and say, there's no one here but one person, right? And God is like, watch this,
Exactly. Yes.
And so I love those aspects of your story.
Yeah. One thing, going back to your first point, I have a good friend that says, when your giftings and your passions meet, you're in your bullseye. So there are giftings that we have that we're not always passionate about. And there's things that we're passionate about that we're not always gifted at. But when those two meet, you're in your bullseye. And I think that is so true. It doesn't mean, like you said, that some days it's not work. But when you can find the ways that God has gifted you with the passions that he gives you, and when those two meet, you are fully in your identity in him. And that's how you have joy, even on the days that are hard, or even on the days that feel more like work than fun, because you are standing in that unique way that he's created you. And that's what I feel like. That's why when I say the podcast is so exciting for me to talk about, is because it feels like, yes, I have this gifting that he's given me with this passion, even with the entrepreneurship and to serve customers, and those two meet at the podcast. It's really cool.
So when you look back, this is the final question I give everyone. When you look back at not just your That Was Stupid story, but That Was Stupid stories, right? There's a divorce, there's a remarriage, there's a business, there's a podcast. And I don't think you can boil all of them down to one, but if there was one lesson, at least from one of those moments that you feel like is most important for our audience here, what would be that was stupid lesson?
Honestly, it boils down to me, I would say, really, truly seek the Lord. When I look back over my life, and that sounds kind of like a corny, just, right answer. But when I look back over my life, there's so many times that I see me taking control, or me trying to fix something, or me trying to start something probably to fulfill a need in me, without really stopping and seeking the Lord. And when I look back and see, like you just mentioned, he is always at work, even something as simple as no one is in the store except this one person, because that's how it's supposed to be. So rather than trying to jump to fix things or change things or start something new or build something new or try to make the marriage work in my own way, or, to stop and look at the Lord and say, what is it that you want me to see right now? What is it that you're teaching me right now? What is the next step that you're wanting me to take right now? My personality, going back to Todd saying I'm a firecracker, he's very true. That's very true. My personality is just to jump into action. And I feel like when I look back over my That Was Stupid stories, many of those moments are me jumping into action, and the Lord and his faithfulness and his kindness cleaning up the messes and giving me grace to move forward and working with, leading me still where he's called me, but working around me and my stubbornness and my control issues. So I think that's the thread that I see through my life and I'm trying to do more faithfully today, is just stop, sit in the moments that God has me, not try to fix them, not even try to change them, even if I want to, but sit in them, listen, and then move when he says move.
Oh, so good. Thank you for being so open, so vulnerable,
Sure.
sharing stuff with us. I think it's just, it's my heart and it's your heart. And so I really appreciate that. Now, if people want to learn more about the podcast, Honey for Your Heart, if they want to learn more about Clover and Bee, where should they go for both of those?
Yeah, if you go to shopcloverandbee.com, you can see all the information about the store, and then the podcast information is on there as well. And the podcast is available on all the major platforms. So we're on a break right now, recording season 3, which you're going to be part of. We're going to do a March Madness series. So you're part of that. Yes. So we're recording season 3. We're on break, but it'll launch again in the fall. So shopcloverandbee.com.
Well, thank you, and maybe we can get some of those non-maternity clothes for the guys of us out there. If I see that, by the way, I'll be like, "Hey, the Lord used me to speak to you to show you that what your customers want." So that's great.
I agree.
Bryson, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I think I don't think this is going to be a one-time thing, so I appreciate you so much.
This was such a joy. Thank you for having me, John.
So I did not expect Bryson to talk about getting pregnant before married, right? I did not expect her to be as open and honest as she was. You can see why in the introduction I was excited about this episode. And so I think her story, there are so many lessons there. She talked about the lesson in the end there about really seeking the Lord, but I think there are so many other big lessons, not just micro lessons, but big lessons about trust, about taking signals, about understanding your customers, even just from a business perspective. I love what she talked about, getting feedback, right? I think so many times we're afraid of feedback. Listen, I don't always take feedback the greatest, right? Like, when I get a comment on something that I write that is negative, I'm dealing with this just recently. A friend of mine left a comment on something that I wrote that was just really baffling. And I was just like, I don't get that. And it's hard for me not to take it personally. And so when you are specifically looking for feedback in order to get better, though, I think that's the mark of someone who is maturing, right? And I know that I have work to do in that arena, and God is continuing to soften those hard edges around my heart. So I hope you enjoyed that podcast with Bryson. Go take a look at Clover and Bee. Go take a look at Honey for Your Heart as well. Listen, if you like this episode, if you like this podcast, please rate it. Please share it, subscribe, do all the things that you know that you can do to support this show. I love doing this. I love bringing you these stories, and we're going to continue to have some amazing stories on this season of That Was Stupid.